Have you ever looked back at a relationship and wondered, why did this hurt so much? Not just because someone left, not just because someone pulled away, but because the pain felt strangely familiar, as if you had lived it before, as if your heart already knew the ending long before the story even began. What if the most painful pattern with avoidant people did not start when you met them? What if it did not start with your first conversation, your first date, or even your first heartbreak? What if the roots of that pain were planted years before you ever crossed paths? And what if the reason you keep finding yourself in the same emotional struggle has less to do with bad luck and more to do with a hidden pattern that has been shaping your life from the very beginning? Think about it. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect at first? Someone who made you feel seen, understood, and special? The connection felt effortless. The chemistry felt undeniable. For a brief moment, it seemed like everything you had been searching for had finally arrived. Then something changed. The warmth became distance. The effort became silence. The closeness became confusion. Suddenly, the person who once moved toward you started moving away, and the harder you tried to understand them, the harder they became to reach. You replayed conversations in your mind. You questioned your worth. You searched for answers. You wondered what you did wrong, and perhaps the most painful part was not losing them. It was losing yourself while trying to keep them. If this experience feels familiar, stay with this until the very end, because by the end of this video, you will understand something that most people never realize. You will discover why this pattern keeps repeating, why it feels so powerful, and most importantly, how to finally break free from it. The answer may completely change the way you see your past relationships and your future ones. The truth is that most people spend years focusing on the wrong question. They ask, why did they pull away? Why couldn't they love me the way I loved them? Why wasn't I enough? But these questions rarely lead to freedom. They keep people trapped in a maze of self-doubt. They keep people searching for explanations inside someone else's behavior while ignoring the deeper forces operating beneath the surface. Because sometimes the relationship is not the real story. Sometimes the real story is the emotional pattern that existed long before the relationship ever began. Human beings are not born with a blank emotional slate. From the very beginning of life, our minds are learning. Our hearts are learning. Every experience teaches us something about connection, trust, safety, and love. Long before we understand language, we begin collecting emotional lessons. Some people learn that closeness is safe. Others learn that closeness comes with pain. Some learn that expressing emotions leads to comfort. Others learn that expressing emotions leads to rejection. These lessons become invisible beliefs, and over time, those beliefs become the lens through which we see every relationship. That is why two people can experience the exact same event and interpret it completely differently. One person sees distance and remains calm. Another sees distance and feels panic. One person experiences conflict and believes it can be resolved. Another experiences conflict and fears abandonment. The event is the same. The emotional blueprint is different. And this is where the story becomes fascinating. Because many of the relationship struggles people face today are not random. They are not accidents. They are not simply the result of meeting the wrong person. Often, they are the result of patterns that have been quietly operating beneath awareness for years. Patterns that influence who we are attracted to. Patterns that influence who feels familiar. Patterns that influence who we chase. Patterns that influence who we cannot let go of. The human brain has a strange tendency. It does not always seek what is healthy. It seeks what is familiar. Read that again in your mind. The brain does not always chase peace. It often chases familiarity. Even when familiarity hurts, even when familiarity creates suffering, even when familiarity breaks your heart. This is why so many intelligent, successful, and self-aware people find themselves trapped in painful relationship cycles. It is not because they are weak. It is not because they are foolish. It is because emotional patterns operate at a level much deeper than logic. You can know better and still repeat the same cycle. You can see the red flags and still feel drawn in. You can promise yourself that this time will be different and still find yourself standing in the same emotional storm. Because patterns are powerful. They live beneath conscious thought. They influence choices before choices even feel like choices. And when these patterns collide with someone who has avoidant tendencies, the result can feel devastating. Not because one person is good and the other is bad, not because one person is right and the other is wrong, but because two emotional worlds are colliding in ways neither person fully understands. The painful part is that most people never see the deeper story. They spend years blaming themselves. They carry guilt that was never theirs to carry. They question their value. They question their attractiveness. They question whether they are lovable. Meanwhile, the real answer remains hidden beneath the surface, but not for much longer, because what you are about to discover is not just about avoidant people. It is not just about relationships. It is about understanding the invisible emotional forces that have shaped your choices, your attachments, and your struggles for years. And once you see them clearly, something remarkable happens. The pattern begins to lose its power. The confusion begins to fade. And for the first time, you stop asking why this keeps happening to you and start understanding how to change it. Because the most painful pattern with avoidance may have been decided long before you met them. But that does not mean it has to decide your future. Once a person begins to recognize that hidden emotional forces are shaping their relationships, a new question naturally appears. If these patterns are operating beneath awareness, why do they keep showing up again and again? Why does someone swear they will never go through the same pain twice, only to find themselves standing in a nearly identical situation months or years later? At first, it seems impossible. The faces are different. The conversations are different. The circumstances are different. Yet somehow, the emotional experience feels strangely familiar. The excitement feels familiar. The uncertainty feels familiar. The waiting feels familiar. Even the disappointment feels familiar. Many people spend years believing they simply have bad luck in relationships. They convince themselves that they keep meeting the wrong people. They think the problem is timing, circumstances, or chance. But human psychology tells a different story. The mind is constantly searching for experiences that match its existing beliefs about love, connection, and emotional safety. This happens so quietly that most people never notice it. Imagine carrying a map without realizing you have one. Every decision you make follows that map. Every direction you choose follows that map. Yet because the map is invisible, you assume you are freely choosing every path. Relationships often work the same way. Deep inside, people carry emotional expectations that were formed long ago. These expectations become filters. They shape attraction. They shape trust. They shape who feels exciting and who feels boring. This is where many people become trapped. Because healthy connection often feels unfamiliar to someone whose emotional history was built around unpredictability. Think about that for a moment. Many people say they want peace. They say they want consistency. They say they want someone who communicates openly. Yet, when such a person enters their life, they sometimes feel little excitement. The connection feels calm. The interaction feels stable. Nothing dramatic is happening. And because there is no emotional roller coaster, they mistake stability for lack of chemistry. Meanwhile, someone emotionally unavailable enters the picture. Suddenly, every text message matters. Every response creates anticipation. Every moment of attention feels valuable. The uncertainty creates emotional intensity, and the brain often confuses intensity with genuine connection. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human relationships. Intensity is not always love. Intensity is not always compatibility. Intensity is not always destiny. Sometimes intensity is simply an old emotional wound being activated. The brain becomes highly alert whenever something feels important to survival. Years ago, emotional closeness may have felt uncertain. Affection may have felt inconsistent. Approval may have felt difficult to earn. As a result, uncertainty became connected to desire. The nervous system learned to associate emotional struggle with significance. Without realizing it, many people begin chasing the very experiences that hurt them. Not because they enjoy suffering, not because they consciously choose pain, but because their inner world has learned to recognize familiar discomfort more easily than unfamiliar security. This explains why someone can leave one painful relationship and later enter another relationship with remarkably similar dynamics. The details change. The emotional script remains. One person withdraws, the other pursues. One becomes distant, the other becomes anxious. One avoids difficult conversations, the other works harder to create closeness. The cycle repeats itself with different names and different circumstances. The pattern survives because the deeper cause remains untouched. Most people focus on the people involved, Very few examine the emotional blueprint operating underneath. That blueprint quietly influences attraction before logic has a chance to speak. This is why advice alone rarely solves the problem. People often know what they should do. They know when someone is unavailable. They recognize warning signs. Friends point them out. Family members point them out. Even their own intuition points them out. Yet they continue moving forward. Why? Because attraction is not created only by conscious thought. It is influenced by emotional familiarity. And emotional familiarity is powerful. It can override common sense. It can silence intuition. It can convince a person to stay hopeful long after evidence suggests otherwise. This does not mean someone is weak. It means they are human. Every person is shaped by experiences that occurred long before they understood what those experiences meant. The child becomes the adult, but the emotional lessons often remain. A person who once learned that affection must be earned may spend years trying to prove their worth. A person who once experienced inconsistency may become highly attached to unavailable partners. A person who once feared rejection may tolerate behavior that should never be accepted. The tragedy is that many individuals spend decades blaming themselves for these experiences. They believe something is wrong with them. They believe they are not attractive enough, not successful enough, not lovable enough. Yet the real issue often has nothing to do with personal value. The issue is that an old emotional program continues running in the background, and until it becomes visible, it continues influencing choices. This is why awareness is so important. The moment someone recognizes the pattern, they gain something incredibly powerful. They gain distance from it. For the first time, they stop viewing every painful experience as an isolated event. Instead, they begin seeing the larger picture. They begin noticing recurring themes, recurring reactions, recurring attractions, recurring disappointments. Suddenly, life starts making sense. The confusion starts turning into understanding. And understanding creates the possibility of change. Because once a person sees the pattern clearly, they can no longer pretend it is random. They can no longer blame luck. They can no longer believe the same outcome keeps appearing by accident. They begin realizing that every repeated experience is pointing towards something deeper, something older, something hidden beneath the surface. And that hidden source is where the real answers are waiting. To understand why avoidant individuals behave the way they do and why these dynamics become so painful, we must go even further back to the place where these protective behaviors were first formed, back to the experiences that taught someone that emotional closeness was not a source of comfort, but something that needed to be managed, controlled, or avoided altogether. The deeper you investigate these repeating relationship experiences, the more one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The behavior that creates so much confusion in adulthood rarely begins in adulthood. It begins much earlier, long before romantic relationships exist, long before dating, commitment, or heartbreak become part of someone's life. To understand why certain people seem uncomfortable with emotional closeness, it is necessary to understand one of the most important needs every human being carries into the world. The need is not success. It is not status. It is not achievement. It is not recognition. Before any of those things matter, there is something far more fundamental. A child needs emotional security. A child needs to know that their feelings matter. A child needs to know that reaching for comfort is safe. A child needs to know that connection is available when fear, sadness, confusion, or distress appears. This need is not weakness. It is part of human survival. From the earliest moments of life, the developing brain is gathering information about relationships, not through lectures, not through advice, but through direct experience. Every interaction sends a message. Every response sends a message. Every moment of emotional connection sends a message. Over time, these experiences begin forming a silent understanding of how the world works. Some children repeatedly experience caregivers who are emotionally present. When they feel scared, someone responds. When they feel overwhelmed, someone helps them regulate their emotions. When they need reassurance, reassurance is available. As years pass, their minds begin developing a powerful belief. People can be trusted, relationships are safe, closeness is not dangerous. but not everyone receives those same experiences. For some children, emotional needs are ignored, minimized, criticized, or misunderstood. Not always because caregivers are cruel, often because caregivers themselves are carrying unresolved struggles. They may be stressed, they may be emotionally unavailable, they may never have learned healthy emotional skills themselves. As a result, the child receives very different messages. They learn that expressing feelings creates discomfort. They learn that vulnerability leads nowhere. They learn that depending on others creates disappointment, and eventually they adapt. This adaptation is where everything begins to change. Human beings are remarkably intelligent when it comes to survival. When a particular strategy repeatedly fails, the mind develops another strategy. If asking for comfort does not work, the child may stop asking. If sharing emotions leads to rejection, the child may stop sharing. If seeking connection results in frustration, the child may learn to rely only on themselves. At first, these adjustments serve a purpose. They reduce emotional pain. They create a sense of control. They help the child navigate an environment that feels uncertain. The problem is that survival strategies do not automatically disappear when childhood ends. They often continue operating long after the original circumstances are gone. A young child who learned to suppress emotional needs may become an adult who struggles to express feelings. A child who learned that closeness brings disappointment may become an adult who keeps others at a distance. A child who discovered that self-reliance feels safer than dependence may become an adult who values independence above everything else. From the outside, these individuals may appear confident. They may appear strong. They may appear unaffected. Yet beneath the surface, a different story often exists. Because avoiding emotional closeness is not always a sign of strength. Sometimes it is a sign of protection. Protection from disappointment, protection from vulnerability, protection from old fears that were never fully resolved. This is one reason avoidant behavior can be so difficult to understand. Many people assume distance means a lack of caring. They assume withdrawal means a lack of interest. They assume emotional restraint means a lack of feeling. But human psychology is far more complicated than that. People can care deeply and still struggle with intimacy. People can desire connection and still fear it. People can want love while simultaneously protecting themselves from it. These contradictions confuse both partners and observers. One moment, an avoidant person may appear engaged and connected. The next moment, they seem unreachable. One day, they move closer. The following day, they create space. This inconsistency often leaves others feeling lost. Yet when viewed through the lens of early emotional learning, the behavior begins making more sense. The avoidant individual is often navigating two competing desires. Part of them wants connection. Part of them fears what connection might require. Part of them wants closeness. Part of them associates closeness with discomfort. These internal conflicts create tension, and that tension frequently appears as emotional distance. The tragedy is that many avoidant individuals do not consciously understand why they react this way. Their responses happen automatically. The protective system activates before conscious reasoning has a chance to intervene. When relationships become emotionally significant, old defenses often become stronger. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they feel. The more vulnerable they feel, the more likely they are to seek emotional space. Not because the other person is necessarily doing something wrong, but because intimacy itself activates unresolved fears. This realization changes everything. It shifts the conversation away from blame. It shifts the focus away from personal inadequacy. And it reveals a much deeper truth. Many of the behaviors that create pain in adult relationships are rooted in lessons learned during life's earliest chapters. Lessons that shaped beliefs. Lessons that shaped expectations, lessons that shaped coping mechanisms, and those lessons continue influencing behavior long after their original purpose has faded. The important thing to understand is that these patterns are not permanent. They are learned, and anything learned can eventually be understood, challenged, and transformed. But before transformation becomes possible, another critical piece must be uncovered, because emotional distance is only the visible part of the story. Beneath that distance lies something many people never see. A hidden struggle that explains why pushing others away often hurts the person doing it just as much as the person being pushed away. And that hidden struggle reveals the true cost of living behind emotional walls.